We actually finished the book of Romans last week, but it occurred to me this week as I was thinking about what to do for the sermon, because now we're not starting a new series, that some of you may not know how the story ends. So just in case, we're going to do an epilogue. If you remember right, Paul wrote to the church at Rome. He'd never been there. His desire was to go there on the way to Spain. Now think, I'm going on a journey this week, right? I want to arrive with my luggage, with my itinerary, knowing where I'm going to go next, knowing what's going to happen. And that's what Paul wanted to do. He wanted to go to Rome, and he wanted to get there with his luggage, and he wanted to get there with the plans to go on to Spain. And it was a good plan. It just didn't turn out that way. When we read the book of Acts, we're going to find out that Paul goes to Jerusalem with that gift he talked about. And there's a riot and some people who plan to kill him. And he's taken into custody by the Romans to protect his life. And he's held over for trial in Caesarea Philippi for a long time, through two different governors. And finally the second governor says, I don't know what to do with this guy. And so he calls in Herodias and says, what do you think? And Paul gets to talk to him, and he says, I have no idea. But Paul says, I appeal to Caesar. One of his rights is a Roman citizen, and we're not even sure how Paul became a Roman citizen. We see that it serves him well at some points. In this situation, maybe not. But all the rights they have, they said, I can appeal to Caesar. And so they said, okay, we'll send you to Rome. So Paul got to go to Rome, but he got to go as a prisoner. And he got to go on this really cool cruise that got lost in a storm. That finally the ship fell apart, and he convinced everybody that they needed to swim to shore. And first off, the centurion was going to kill them all, kill all the prisoners, which was Paul. But he said, in a dream, I found out that if we all go, we're all going to get to shore. And so they all got to shore. And remember that situation? They were all warming themselves by the fire. All of us have been picking up wood around here and burning, right? And Paul was carrying some wood, and out jumps this little nasty snake, bites him. And Paul shakes it off into the fire. He doesn't want anybody else to get bit. And they expect him to turn blue and die. But he doesn't. And so he spends some time healing people on that island, and they hear about the gospel of Jesus. And from that island, little tiny island, they take another boat. By the way, what happens when your boat wrecks? Do you get your luggage? I mean, sometimes when the boat doesn't wreck, you don't get your luggage, right? All right, so the guys without luggage now, any money they had, they're down to whatever they're wearing on their back. And so they get to the mainland, and they do the very last section by foot, which is the Appian Way. A straight road that Claudius Appius had made. And so they're walking along the Appian Way, and as they approach Rome, tradition tells us that the Christians found out he was coming. And they lined the Appian Way. And they threw flowers. And they handed him flowers. And they were so happy to see this shipwrecked, exhausted, dirty, tired man who had wrote the letter that we call Romans. And it took him by surprise because he didn't know how they received the letter. What a cool story. What a cool story. He stayed there in prison. A house prison. They actually let him rent his own house. And he had prisoners come in, guards come in to watch him. And it turns out that a lot of them became believers. Because when he writes the prison letters that we have from Rome, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, the prison letters, he talks about those of the Praetorian Guard who are believers and greetings. Well, how did they become believers? Well, they got to spend some time with Paul. Paul had a huge influence there. For all we know, Paul was released. For all we know, the Pharisees never showed up to accuse him, and he was released. Tradition has it later, under Nero, that he was arrested again during the Roman persecution. And because he was a Roman citizen, he wasn't crucified, he wasn't burnt, he was beheaded, which was the most humane way they had. And he died in Rome. The epilogue. What happens? What happens when you influence people that you don't even know how they're going to take this message? This message that we call the book of Romans, the message that talks about how Jews and Gentiles can love each other and feel equally loved by God. Paul made some amazing statements about his life. And we're going to look at them. We're going to look at 3 statements he made. And we're going to look at them in chronological order. Okay? Because this is important. Turn with me over to 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians chapter 15. This is an early book, and we've been studying it on Sunday morning, and we tried to finish it today, and we did not succeed. 1 Corinthians chapter 15. But we did finish chapter 15. 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Paul makes a statement about himself. He says, we're going to start in verse 7. I'm sorry, verse 9. If we're looking right into those lights. For I am the least of the apostles. I do not even deserve to be called an apostle because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God, I am what I am. And His grace to me was not without effect. No, I worked harder than all of them. I'm talking about the other apostles. Yet not I, but the grace of God that was with me. Okay, we talked about that word last week. We talked about what the word apostle means. One sent. There were apostles that Jesus sent out. There were apostles that the church sent out. There were people in Corinth that Paul called super apostles, okay? That the church at Corinth really looked up to highly. Paul said, yeah, I'm an apostle, but I am the least. I'm down here. Because I persecuted the church of God before I became a believer. But I worked all the harder. And by the grace of God, I am what I am, and I worked all the harder. I am the least of the apostles. Okay, that's still pretty impressive though, isn't it? Right? That's like, you know, I'm second string on the team that won the Olympics. Hey, you were on the team. I'm the least of the apostles. Turn with me over to Ephesians. Ephesians chapter 3. Ephesians chapter 3. It says in Ephesians, he says, we're going to start, I hate this jumping around all over the Bible. Ephesians chapter, we're going to start verse 7. Ephesians 3, verse 7. He says, I'm in Galatians, which is the main problem here. Ephesians chapter 3, verse 7. I'm there with you now. Please be patient with me. I became a servant of this gospel by the gift of God's grace given to me through the working of His power. Although I am less than the least of all God's people, this grace was given to me to preach to the Gentiles the unsearchable riches of Christ, and to make plain to everyone my administration of this mystery, which for ages past was kept hidden in God, who created all things. All right, did you catch it? What did he say about himself this time?
Least of all saints.
I'm less than the least. Of the apostles? No. Of all of God's people. Paul says now, even of all believers, Here's where I stand.